This episode of the podcast is supported in part by Sawtooth Outfitters. They're located right off Highway 61 in Tofte. It's the holiday season, and Jeff and Sarah are going to be reopening December 26th. And last I heard from Jeff and Sarah, they're hoping for an awesome winter, and of course we are too. That ranges from everything from skiing to winter camping, getting out in the Boundary Waters, some of the local ski trails, the slopes, of course, Lutsen Mountains. Jeff and Sarah have so much in the way of offerings for all of the winter recreation here across the Boundary Waters and the North Shore area. That's Sawtooth Outfitters, Highway 61 in Tofte. Find them online at their website as well and their social media pages. And thanks to Sawtooth Outfitters for supporting the podcast throughout most of the year. So really appreciate Jeff and Sarah and their support.
The accumulated result of seemingly small decisions and actions may cause a significant gain or loss of wilderness character over time. Because of this complexity, preserving wilderness character requires that managers approach wilderness stewardship with humility, respect, and restraint. This is an excerpt from a document signed by the U.S. Forest Service and Minnesota DNR regarding fisheries management in the Boundary Waters.
Welcome to the Paddle and Portage podcast. Today's episode centers around motorized uses in the Boundary Waters canoe area.
Restrictions, limitations on motor use has been chipped away at, reduced, restricted for decades, many decades, in what's now called the BWCA wilderness, the Boundary Waters. There's still some use of motors that are allowed, legally allowed, including for tows in places like Saginaw and Moose Lake. So there's still some motor use that occurs inside the BWCA.
Absolutely, and under very specific circumstances with search and rescue and safety and emergency medical assistance is necessary.
Right, and there's also another use for motors that's used by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources for fish stocking and fish surveys.
And so starts today's episode with your journey on a plane into the heart of the wilderness.
I'm here on the shoreline of Little Saginaw Lake, and we are pretty deep in the Boundary Waters. Probably hear the water lapping up on shore. Maybe you can hear the airplane flying away. I'm here with E.J. Isaac. He is the Grand Marais Area Fisheries Supervisor, and we're going to be doing what's called fish survey work out here for the next couple days. So hot right now for September, certainly, and yeah, unseasonably kind of hot, uncomfortable, at least for me, somebody who doesn't really like the heat a whole lot. So we got some work to do, and we're going to get to it. After we were dropped off, we were left with our square stern canoe. I was there as a volunteer for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources for a week of fish survey work, and it was time to mount the motor on the back of the square stern. After it was safely secured, EJ fired the motor to life. After the engine roared to life, the hull and gunnels rattled with excitement. EJ gave more fuel to the motor and increased our speed. Then we were off to find fish in the name of science.
Hello, my name's Riley. I'm the community coordinator for Friends of the Boundary Waters here in Ely. We're located at our office just off of Central and Sheridan, and it just started to snow, looking like winter finally here in Ely. I'd love to see you around and see you at an event this winter.
In This episode of the Paddle and Portage Podcast is brought to you by Tuscarora Lodge and Canoe Outfitters. They're located on Round Lake, and Tuscarora is a full-service Boundary Waters outfitter serving Gunflint Trail entry points, and they are now booking holiday and winter cabin stays. You can check them out online at TuscaroraCanoe.com or at Tuscarora Canoe on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. I see Andy has been out, will be soon at the very least, checking ice conditions up the Gunflint Trail. It's going to be forming as we roll deeper into the holiday season. But yeah, check out their holiday and winter cabin stays. Perfect time to be up the Gunflint. The DNR has been using motors inside the federally protected BWCA wilderness for many decades. Use of motors range from the stocking of fish by airplane to the studying of fish populations using boats and nets on the many scattered lakes across the boundary waters. The DNR is allowed to use motors in the nation's most visited wilderness, and this permission to do so comes from the U.S. Forest Service. Conducted under the label of fisheries management, each year the DNR performs something that's known as a fish survey on a handful of lakes scattered across the wilderness. These surveys can take place on small lakes toward the end of the Arrowhead Trail to the far reaches of Lac LaCroix. These lake surveys consist of periodic monitoring of the fish populations, water chemistry, and fish habitat. In September, EJ and I, along with an abundance of gear belonging to the DNR, were flown into Little Sag. It was a particularly warm week in mid-September when we visited this remote wilderness lake, spending 3 nights and 4 days setting gill nets and gathering information from the fish that those nets captured. During that time, we caught many fish: northern pike, burbot, perch, white suckers, and a few lake trout. We also happened upon more than a dozen canoeists and were within earshot of many more during the trip, despite the lake's distance from the nearest entry point. Some of the people that we came across were visibly agitated at the fact we were motoring around on this remote lake inside the boundary waters. I asked EJ while we were out there about how this was impacting him.
Why come to a lake like Little Sag? So remote, you don't stock, you don't manage it. Why do this?
So there's a few reasons, and again, maybe we'll preface this with, we don't do this often. And it's not like we come here to do this with any regularity. You know, it's been a decade and a half since we're last here. But the ability for us to continue keeping tabs on lakes that are remote and more pristine, or maybe we think of them as less exploited. These lakes don't receive much angling pressure. So we can kind of get a glimpse into how these lakes function naturally in the absence of strong human harvest. So we can see how the lake trout's doing out here in a more natural setting, in the absence of harvest. We also get information on, this is a big body of water, and we do have concerns for lake trout about our lakes continuing to support lake trout. Do we have enough thermal habitat? Like, do we have enough water that's cold and well oxygenated for these fish? So being able to come in here to these large kind of remote systems gives us a snapshot as to, well, this might be the best case scenario for these fish. How are they doing in their natural environment versus a lake that maybe we manage or easier to get to, but we also have a lot of other impacts that are hard to tease apart when we do a survey, whether if we know what exploitation is or other watershed factors that could be influencing those populations. Here we get a snapshot of what it's like in its kind of natural state.
What about the motor aspect on the wilderness lake?
So there's a MOU agreement between the state of Minnesota and the U.S. Forest Service to get in to access some of these lakes. There had been, throughout time, there had been some revisions of this agreement, but a long process to determine where it's allowable and where it's not. And for us to be able to do something like this, this water body had to be far enough into the boundary waters that it was deemed not accessible by any other methods other than being flown in, as well as the size of the lake that we're flown into is big enough for safety concerns. We have a large canoe with an outboard motor. So there's not very many of these systems that fit the criteria or meet the criteria to do this work. This just happens to be one of them. And if we think about it, we're here for the couple-day survey, and we're probably not going to be back to this lake for decades. So it's kind of a small opportunity of a window we have to be here to do this.
Hey, we're just on the main drag here in Ely, outside of Ely Outfitting Company. They've got their used canoes for sale for the season. They've got the whole inventory listed online at the website, elyoutfittingcompany.com. And if you're down here in Ely, you're going to see them when you're driving down the main drag here. There's a couple different racks of them. North Star, some other brands. You can't miss this if you're driving down the main drag. It's like the most robust stand of used canoes that are for sale. Jason and the crew want you to get them on the website, so check that out. And if you're in Ely, you're going to see it. They're going to be covered in snow soon because it's snowing right now here downtown. A perfect holiday gift would be a used canoe from Ely Outfitting Company. Since at least 1949, the DNR and the Forest Service have operated under a series of agreements that detail how they will work together to achieve common goals in terms of land, water, and wildlife management in the Boundary Waters region. In government talk, these are known as Memorandums of Understanding, or simply MOUs. In 1988, the DNR and Forest Service signed what was called a Master MOU for the purpose of working together to, among other things, protect and manage fish and wildlife populations and habitat across Superior National Forest, which includes the BWCA. There's some specifics and rules and regulations regarding how many lakes the DNR can use a motor on in any given year and how many times they're allowed to use an airplane to fly into the wilderness. This year, one of the major operations in terms of lake surveys in the Boundary Waters for the Grand Marais office was the work on Little Sag. Kathy Quinn is the Wilderness Program Manager on Superior National Forest, which includes the entire Boundary Waters. I asked her about how many complaints the Forest Service receives on an annual basis in terms of the DNR or another agency, including the Forest Service itself, using motors inside the Boundary Waters.
I would say it's more commonly like, oh, this is some illegal use that someone is concerned about. I personally haven't had complaints come to me about, just any, whether it's legal administrative use or not. I haven't had that feedback. I haven't been sitting in my more centralized role on the forest, but for now only a couple years. But even in my time, the previous 7 years prior to that on the East Zone, it was pretty infrequent. So it's usually about, hey, we saw a motorboat on such and such lake, or an airplane flew really low, or an airplane landed and dropped some people off or picked them up, and these sorts of reports, and just people just honestly trying to do good and make sure that there isn't anything illegal happening.
In the BWCA wilderness, the DNR says that strong public demand for knowledge about fish and fishing in lakes in the BWCA justifies the use of motors, despite the fact that the agency does not manage some of the lakes.
Yeah, I'm Dave Weitzel. I'm the Northeast Region Assistant Fisheries Manager. So we really try to target low use periods, early in the season, late in the season, and try to reduce that impact as much as we possibly can. But unfortunately, with some of these locations, it just wouldn't be possible to collect the data without using a motorboat, or in some cases we even have to access the lake with airplane. So to have all of those things that you already mentioned, the historical database, a big thing that we're able to do with these surveys is go into systems that aren't impacted by development. So we can see the changes that we're seeing in those lakes are much more likely to be attributed to broader scale environmental change than something in the Grand Rapids area where we have a lot of population growth. So there's really a lot of upside and need for us to do those surveys, but we certainly are mindful of those recreational impacts for the folks that want to use those resources.
During our September trip to Little Sag, EJ from the DNR spoke with several paddlers who were camping, canoeing, and fishing on Little Sag. The reactions to people who saw us and the motorboat were a mixed bag. From the noticeably agitated campers who were standing on the edge of a campsite on the shoreline with their arms crossed, to a group of 6 canoeists in 3 separate canoes who EJ engaged in conversation with.
What has been the reaction to canoeists to seeing you on the lake?
Well, from our experience here, talking with some of the anglers and canoeists that were here, they were, they were kind of curious at first, maybe. They saw the float plane come in and land and kind of want to make sure just, hey, what's going on? People might wonder if there's a search and rescue or some other activities. And, after talking, people are excited and they're asking lots of questions about, are you guys doing the lake survey? Does it look better than before? A lot of people here are enjoying the recreation of the Boundary Waters, and also, fishing is a huge component of what I think most of the people are doing on their trips in some extent. So people are really curious, how's the fishing? Where are the fish? How do we catch some bigger fish? So it kind of, fisheries opens that door for communication where people are wanting to learn, share, and for us, again, to share from our perspective, what are we finding? So they're very curious on, what did we find?
Jason Butcher is the forest aquatic biologist for the Forest Service on Superior National Forest. He said the development of the MOU that the state and federal governments crafted to manage fish inside the Boundary Waters does not mean the implementation of the document is always easy, or, as Jason said, warm and fuzzy between the two agencies.
I tell folks that the development of that MOU it's not always warm and fuzzy. Like, we acknowledge that we have different missions and goals and are coming at it from different ways. And we really, there's a fair amount of hashing things out in those MOUs that, behind the scenes, we've had numerous meetings about, and folks looking into policy and guidelines and law and things like that. So they're not, it's one of those MOUs. It's not like a warm fuzzy. And it works very well. It fosters good partnership and good discussion, but it's definitely was hard work to get us to that point.
Weitzel, EJ, and the DNR aren't oblivious to the fact that their work can be disruptive to people on their canoe trips to the Boundary Waters. Disruption's a fair word to use, the DNR acknowledges, as the chug of a motor is not part of the singing wilderness that's romanticized in the minds of those who are charmed by the words of Sigurd Olson, for example. Weitzel says he understands when people are concerned about seeing a motorboat deep in the wilderness.
Yeah, and I certainly understand those concerns. And if we can, let folks know that we are available, absolutely encourage them to reach out to those area offices. We want to hear from them. We want to hear from the folks that go during, what was traditionally the off season. Part of the reason why we go when we do has to do with agreements with the Forest Service. They're the ones that are really managing that landscape. So they pretty much are the ones that give us permission to go again in the spring and in the fall. Our memo of understanding with them really doesn't allow us to go during the middle parts of the summer. And maybe that's something that as those demographics change over time, those are the kind of discussions that we can have. And that's something that could certainly be brought up in discussions. So maybe we're a little reactive based on traditional use patterns, and that's things that we can look at into the future.
All right, Joe, you're taking us heavy into the topics of the politics and ethics and what that means for wilderness character, but you flew into the Boundary Waters. You saw it from the sky. You haven't even talked about what that experience was like.
On a beautiful September day where some of the maples were starting to turn below. So there's some red mixed in with the pine and the popple and the birch. And so it was just gorgeous. And to see those lakes, you know, we flew out from Devil Track Lake up the Gunflint Trail, and then we're flying over Brule Lake. You know, the pilot was pointing out, like, that's Brule, and I can see on this radar equipment what lake is below us. So to see Brule, Winchell, then we're continuing over, headed toward Little Sag, covering a lot of miles in a really short amount of time. I mean, it took us like 20 minutes or something to fly all that way. And looking for moose. I mean, I had my glasses on so I could see really well down on the forest floor, and not seeing any, but just you could see really, really well. It was kind of surreal. It was a little bit like, I can't believe this is happening, and this is so incredible and beautiful, and this feels really strange at the same time, all of that. You know, I went in on Pine Lake the year before and did this fish survey. So this is like a thing I've experienced before, and it was a similar feeling of like, I'm in this motorboat, and it's interesting that we're zooming down the lake, but it also feels kind of weird.
Do you mean like kind of wrong?
In the boat, it does. And I still felt that way on Little Sag. But in the plane, it's so brief for one thing, in such an unfamiliar space, that it didn't feel wrong to be in the plane. It was just like mind-blowing. And mostly in a good way.
How can something wrong feel so right?
Yeah, and I don't think that I don't think there's anything wrong with the Forest Service flying the beaver over them.
But it's not, I mean, wrong in the sense of it's an exception to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
It is an allowed way to break the rule.
Right. I mean, when you're with the agencies, like, that's when it's okay. And so that's why this was a big deal to be invited on this, first of all. I know that, we're analyzing the process here and how motorized use to study fish impacts wilderness character and other user groups and so forth. But it's still, I was really grateful that the DNR asked me to come on this trip. We need to say that point blank, like, this was some pretty important access to get, and that's not to be overlooked.
Using motors in the wilderness wasn't the only strange thing about this trip and this time of year. It was mid-September, but the weather felt like August. 80-degree highs some days that week, no wind, but even more incredibly, no bugs. It was the most ideal conditions a Boundary Waters traveler could ask for in the middle of what typically is the season of change. And so it all was surreal. I was just not far away from you on Knife Lake when I heard an airplane taking off in the wilderness, and I thought to myself, that may be Joe Fredericks flying around.
This episode of the Paddle and Portage podcast is brought to you by Tuscarora Lodge and Canoe Outfitters. They're located on Round Lake, and Tuscarora is a full-service Boundary Waters outfitter serving Gunflint Trail entry points, and they are now booking holiday and winter cabin stays. You can check them out online at TuscaroraCanoe.com or at Tuscarora Canoe on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. I see Andy has been out, will be soon at the very least, checking ice conditions up the Gunflint Trail. It's going to be forming as we roll deeper into the holiday season. But yeah, check out their holiday and winter cabin stays. Perfect time to be up the Gunflint.
We often focus our attention on the most meaningful stories from the wilderness, life-changing experiences, tales of trials and tribulation. This story for you, Joe, feels a little bit more complex. What was it like for you having to bring up and ask hard questions of our friends and colleagues in the DNR and the Forest Service?
I want to say, first of all, that the DNR and the Forest Service, EJ, Kathy Quinn, and these people that I talked to at length about wilderness character and motorized use and why is this still done and so forth, were very receptive, not defensive posturing or aggressive in their because that's the way it is type thing. Like they would hear my questions and gave thoughtful responses, and we talked at length. I've got hours of audio from the DNR and the Forest Service that went into the written piece in particular that we have on the website, paddleandportage.com, about this same story and topic. And it felt comfortable to have those conversations with professional colleagues. And in fact, the Forest Service wrote me back and said, thanks for asking these questions. And the DNR, multiple from EJ here in the Grand Marais office to down in Grand Rapids and even down toward the metro, like this was communicated through many tiers of the fisheries management in the DNR. So people were taking this really seriously and seemed to be supportive of the fact that I was asking some difficult questions. And I think that's really cool. It was helpful to me as a journalist in writing a story and as someone who cares about the boundary waters too. I appreciated their forthcoming and the response and the engagement throughout. That said, the motorized use and being a part of this as a volunteer essentially was what I was. I mean, I filled out the paperwork for the DNR to be a volunteer to go on this. And that part of it was a little harder for me to be an active participant in. As I said earlier in the episode, I've done these fish surveys before inside the wilderness line where motorboats are used, and it just doesn't feel right for some reason, having paddled some of those lakes where we're now motoring down. But that's my canoeist person who likes the boundary waters speaking, not as an objective reporter where I can understand the reasoning of the science as EJ and the wilderness character and the memorandum of understanding as we heard from the agencies throughout the episode. Like I get that as a reporter. Stepping away from that, I told Kathy Quinn this at the end of our discussion, that as somebody who goes to the boundary waters and who's now seen this, the practice of using these nets on these remote wilderness lakes where there's no management involved does seem a bit dated in how it's done and why it's done and what the results and the findings mean. That's my observation of this.
We are always approaching these stories from our perspective as paddlers and our perspective as storytellers trying to understand and get the facts. And like so many of the complex stories that exist in our world right now, the answers are rarely, if ever, clear or black and white. This is a fine time to exist as a human with unclear answers.
All we have to do is go back to the Winter Camping Symposium and our experiences there, where things can be this and that. Everything doesn't have to be so objective all the time or so one-sided, or as you take a stand. It's either you're a canoeist and you don't want these motorboats in here, or you stand with the science and the reasoning behind it. I kind of land on both. I can get both. I understand why those guys on Little Sag were standing there mean-mugging us. I get it. And I understand what EJ is saying. We got to have some kind of historical marker on this really remote lake so that future generations will have some sort of record of where this lake went wrong or where it went right or why it's the same. I think it's science. I get that too.
You've officially been invited, you, our listeners, to continue to move into the this and that of reality. That is probably the only way forward for us as humanity to have any hope in finding solutions to our complex conundrums. We thank you for listening to our little slice of the pie. Make sure to go check out all the additional content on this story and others at paddleandportage.com. We make this for you. We love hearing from you. Keep sending us your stories and your opinions.
And for subscribers to Paddle and Portage, the article about this, which is many thousands of words, like 4,000 plus words, is available on the website. It's a really in-depth analysis of the whole trip. It includes the interviews, transcripts, part of it, quotes from Kathy Quinn and Jason with the Forest Service, as well as EJ and Dave from the DNR. And there's links to the MOU that we were talking about throughout the episode. It's for subscribers to Paddle and Portage, and a perfect opportunity to jump in. It's under the umbrella of our magazine, so if you listen to the podcast, you're going to definitely like the content that we have for our subscribers on Paddle and Portage. You can do that at paddleandportage.com. Just click on the membership tab, and it'll take you right there. So thanks for supporting the podcast. Thanks for supporting Paddle and Portage, and I hope that you're getting ready for winter, because it is here now, basically, at least up in the Boundary Waters region. We've already got some amazing trips planned for the winter season, so in many ways, in that regard, we're just getting into my favorite time of year up here. And yours too. Yours too, LB.
But you, Joe Frederick,
There's a storm on the mountain. It cuts through the trees. It cuts like a chisel. It's cutting through me. And there's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home. Up at the tree line, and look at the whale. Clouds through the peaks now, like a torn sail. And there's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home. Oh, look at that mountain when the green light fails. Clouds piling up now in a blistering gale. There's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home. God have mercy on the fools up there. Don't stand a chance, don't stand a prayer. There's no way home, there's no way home, there's no way home. If it gets too heavy, it'll all come down. You may hear the thunder, don't turn around. There's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home. For the wind of the future is born of the past. The storm on the mountain is coming on fast. Yeah, there's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home. There's a storm on a mountain. It cuts through the trees. It cuts like a chisel. And it's cutting through me. And there's no way home. There's no way home. There's no way home.